Welcome to the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast.
And I would always try to be the happiest team, personally. That's probably why I wasn't a very good competitor. We would always be there. What's the best experience? Well, it turns out stopping for 20 minutes at that ice cream stand in the little mountain village and trying this weird thing is actually amazing. Or taking the drink from the tribe in the Amazon. Yeah, maybe they spit the coca leaves into it. I don't know. We're going to do this because I'm never going to be here ever again. Out there for the experience and up for anything. I feel like there's so many different ways to answer that. And what would be successful for one team is probably totally different than another.
Well, for me, the action is the juice. I'm in.
As listeners of the Dark Zone know, we are strong supporters of Ascend Athletics and their goal of empowering women and girls through leadership mountaineering in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This summer, they're expanding their reach to support 150 women in Afghanistan, and they're exploring an ambitious expedition to K2 base camp in Pakistan, led by renowned mountaineers Naila Kiani and Vibeke Sefland. Ascend Athletics is truly redefining opportunity for women around the world. Be sure to check out ascendathletics.org to learn more about their mission. Once again, ascendathletics.org, and you can find that link in the show notes. Keep in mind, as I always point out, they pay nothing for this promo. Instead, we love the work that they do, and we're happy to spread it to the world. The Dark Zone is happy to support and partner with AR School. What is AR School? Well, it's an online service that ensures that you have access to the expertise that you need so you, as an adventure racer, can continue to level up. We all know that progress can be slow, so why waste time repeating mistakes or wondering if you're using the right tactics? AR School brings together world-class training, top competitors, and athletes of all levels. It's like a transition area between races where you can learn what works, share your expertise, and fuel your passion alongside other racers. AR School is launching soon, so join me and several top competitors inside AR School by joining the waitlist at www.thearschool.com. That's thearschool.com. Welcome to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. Wow, episode 100 of the Dark Zone. If you told me 3 years ago in April of 2021, when this idea popped into my head that I'd be here 100 episodes later, I would not believe you. Along the way, I've had the chance to speak to a whole variety of adventure racers and directors and fans and volunteers, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to bring this to the AR world. In those early days, there are 3 people that I want to remember and shout out, thanking them for their early guidance. One is Abby Perkis of Rootstock Racing. She was an inveterate supporter of the idea and was a huge support at the beginning. Annie Hartley of Barf Racing was there, as well as Monette Bailey. 3 voices guided, helped me, got the podcast off the ground, and here we are 3 years later. The Dark Zone was founded on the idea that adventure racing is by itself a unique and special sport. The combination of teamwork, strategy, physical ability, logistics, all of those factors come together to create a unique experience that is not found in many sports. And the Dark Zone has always been about honoring what adventure racing is, and along the way seeing these amazing races going on, from people who are at the front of the pack, the tip of the spear, to the person who's just trying out for their first race. Adventure racing is a big tent, and we want to bring more and more of that ethic to the world. And we love what we get to do for the AR community. And we're glad that you're here. Over the course of these 3 years, over the course of these 100 episodes, our community has grown over time. And we are so grateful to you, the listener, who gives us ideas and thoughts and suggestions, sees us at races, sends us emails, brings their very best selves to the podcast. We are going to keep doing what we're doing over here in Dark Zone World Headquarters. We want to expand and get a bit bigger. Your thoughts and suggestions, your guest recommendations are always welcome. And we are delighted that you are willing to join us here on the Dark Zone. This has been and will continue to be a love letter to the adventure racing community. We are so grateful that we get to be here alongside you, to see the races unfold, to see what we very often get to enjoy is the capacity of human beings when they work together for a common cause. And the adventure racing world gives us hope and excitement for the world outside of adventure racing. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a listener. And thank you for joining us for the 100th episode of The Dark Zone. Let's now turn to our guest for the 100th episode. Untamed New England is a special adventure race. Legendary, well-known, well thought of by many racers. And my white whale, my Moby Dick, the guest I track down over time and space is Untamed New England race director Grant Killian. There was emails, months, time, borderline harassment, but he agreed to come onto the show, and this is a great interview. So sit back and relax, enjoy the 100th episode of The Dark Zone. Thank you, Grant, for being here. Enjoy the show, and have a great listen. I've always heard about the Untamed New England races have been spoken of with a high level of respect and a high level of people have really enjoyed them. And I think there's a whole generation of racers now and race directors that have used Untamed New England as kind of a, whether they realize it or not, sort of a template for how they build their own races. So for the sake of the listener, could you walk us through, give us the history of your AR, your career, your directing, and how you ended up being such a good director?
Oh, geez. Well, thank you. It's, I guess, like any kind of origin story, you can go way, way back, but just to skip over a lot of it, I found myself out of college kind of with a background in doing sports and things. And in the real world, you have to work all day. And so I was really kind of at a loss and a little, I don't know, just looking around for something to stay active. And a friend of mine said, hey, come down to Florida. There's this, I think it was a 36-hour race, Howl at the Moon adventure race. This was 2003, maybe 2002. And so I showed up down there and did this race. It was great. It was a lot of fun. We did terrible, but it didn't even matter. I mean, I think we had Schlitz at the finish line, and like there were guys out there in cut off jean shorts, and like it was really grassroots, I guess, let's say. But that being my first race experience kind of opened my eyes, like, oh, this is kind of a fun like subculture. And I was one of the youngest people out there, which I liked at the time because I, was kind of a washed up college athlete and feeling like, boy, I'll never recapture what I used to be able to do on the soccer field. And so anyhow, that kind of lit a fire under me to do a lot of races. And so I was doing several, and I kept being disappointed by one aspect or another, or many all at the same time. Some of these races, I would joke, they had cut so many corners, they were going to be totally round. There was nothing left to cut. We had one race where the organizers said, well, there's no off-limit areas, but if you get pulled over, stopped by police or any people, just don't tell them you're part of the event.
And yeah, that's a little rough. Okay.
I mean, and like you show up for like the check-in and there's nobody there. There was like a note like on a rock, under a rock saying, come back tomorrow, So we'd gone all like 6 hours into like Western Virginia for this race, and I couldn't believe it. It was so disappointing. So we thought, well, we can do better. And so we did. My wife and I and some friends, we started putting on smaller races with a focus really being on like the racer experience. And it was never about trying to get rich or anything like that. And so we would just pump all the money that we would take from the proceeds into the next race. And bit by bit kind of built a great family of staff and volunteers to come help, and got a lot of experience along the way. I think I joke and think there's maybe 100 different ways to not run an adventure race business that I've tried and failed at, but along the way, like made some great memories. And like some of those events that you said are at the latter end of that, but mostly the Mid-Atlantic is where we started doing races. And then we moved to New England. We were actually moving overseas, and we spent a summer in New England. And I really was like, well, where are the multi-day races in New England? Like there's gotta be, there's a great terrain up here. And so the Appalachian Extreme was a race that was put on by Norm Grunberg and Trayson Thayer. So this is like 20 years ago. They had an expedition race or two up in New England, and they would do some smaller races occasionally. But this was 2007, and there was no races of any real size in New England at all. And so we thought, well, let's just do one in New England. So we spent the summer specking it out, having a lot of meetings with land managers, and put a course together. And then we held the first Untamed New England race the following year. And it was, successful, I think, because New England is just such an amazing location for a race. Like it's close enough to population centers, both in Canada and the US, that you can get there more or less in a day. Most people can. And then the terrain itself probably speaks for itself. Like there's some great variety without having to be, 10 hours away from the nearest airport, that kind of thing. So
right about that.
It was a coincidence, really. It all came together.
And the idea like of having Boston right there, you can fly into Boston, you can fly into New York and drive up. There's a huge playground, and the swaths of land are just massive. And I think as compared to the American West, I think the land management is easier in the American East. I think a lot of the federal land out West makes it hard to work with those. That's why they really kind of struggle for big races out in that huge land out there, where it feels easier in the East. It's not easy, but it feels easier. Was that your experience?
I've grew up in Colorado, so I've dabbled, I guess, in getting some permits and things negotiated in at least the Rockies, like Southwest Colorado, even Utah, and the permitting there, it's tough, man. It's really tough. There's single land organizations like BLM, but I mean, the same rules apply there as apply in a lot of like the Northeast. Like you can't be a group bigger than 10 people. You can't be there at night. You can't mountain bike. You can't be off trail. I mean, there's a long list of things you can't do, and you pile them all up and you realize you can't actually do a race, that's more than maybe a couple hours at most in those places. I think that's true New England or the West. I think the West is there's just so much more like open space. It feels like it should be easier, and it isn't. I can get a very quick rejection in New England, and I can get a very long rejection out in the West, but ultimately it's still a rejection.
I think also too, the hard part too is explaining the sport. I mean, land managers, God love them, right? They have a lot of responsibility because everything that happens on their property is their responsibility. And if they say yes, they own the outcome. And I tried to bring a pack rafting event into a state park, just in southern New York State, and attempting to explain to the land manager that, listen, we have these boats, they're called pack rafts, and we could put in anywhere in the shoreline with no problem at all. It blew their mind because in their world, the only place you could enter the water is at a formal dock or a beach. You can't just get in the water anywhere. So the challenge is describing the event so that they understand it and then getting them to take the risk on themselves.
Yeah, I found that it's always easy to say no. And if you ask enough people, eventually someone will. And so it's really, you got to build the relationships. It takes years. Like I've now had some relationships for 10 years or longer. Some of them, unfortunately, they're passing away or retiring even. But yeah, it's a real challenge trying to convince land managers that have a public remit to give you that kind of special access.
When you think of the race experience, and here's why I asked this question, Grant, is that a large part of our listenership are people who clearly enjoy adventure racing, right? We're a niche sport. We're small, but we're people who enjoy it, really enjoy it. And a lot of adventure racers eventually graduate up into possibly race directing or assisting or volunteering. When you define the idea of the racer experience, what does that mean to you?
I think one of the great things about the sport is it can be so many different things for the variety of people who participate. I know some people who are so motivated. They're like, they have law degrees and they probably work 60-hour, weeks, and they're like driven. They've got like a triathlon schedule to train. And then I have other people like who I know who are kind of off the couch racers and are not particularly fit, and they're just there for fun. And it can be actually a rewarding event for the whole spectrum. For me personally, it's always about the discovery of something new. And so it's tough for me to like get super excited about going to like the New England wilderness for a race just personally, because I do a lot of that just, in my own. But like for me, it's an opportunity to see a different part of the world, to travel and really see like a, wilderness or ecosystems or culture, that's different, and a chance to really experience like the area that I really like. And so I've tried to showcase like the local cultures, trying to have like a cookout at the fire station, having them do like a local fish fry or something like that. We have one group that wanted to bring a grill to the top of this mountain, and they were like, well, we're going to grill a bunch of stuff up here for all the racers, and a chance for the locals to really like put their best foot forward. And I feel like that type of element, like along with, other excellent things like, sensible course design and like challenging navigation and like a nice variety of activities, all that stuff I feel like goes into it. But for me, it's ultimately about like the discovery. And like, I think some of the best races personally that I've participated in were like the furthest ones away, like places I would never go otherwise, like southern Chile or Ecuador or places like that, just because, I don't get there very often.
I do want to pivot to your own personal racing in a second, but I want to come back to the idea of the Untamed New England. You mentioned Appalachian Extreme as being a race that you had known about, had done there. And so when was the first race that you put on? What was the first race that you directed, that you start to finish, planned the course, had the racers? Mm-hmm. What was your first one?
So this was 2004, and this was like, we had a dinner club where we'd get together like once a month and cook like something on a theme. And I think it was like, I don't know, we had too much wine or something and decided, hey, let's do this event. And it was in our local park down in Newport News, Virginia. I think 2004 was it. And it was, I think 5 or 6 couples. We kind of divided up the tasks. And I think ultimately I enjoyed it probably more than everybody else. A lot of people were concerned about liability and, safety and like the logistics and how the finances work. To me, that didn't matter. For me, it was just, oh, this is such a cool way we can connect these different parts of the course. And, oh, look at this river. No one's even gone here. Getting the chance to showcase this stuff that's, just in people's backyards was kind of fun. And so
it's funny you bring that up because I have heard that as a guerrilla kind of fun, informal activity is like 5 or 6 racers, and perhaps with their spouses, their partners, their teammates. Mm-hmm. Everybody takes a discipline, and you all agree, okay, I'm doing the biking section, you're doing the trekking section, you're doing the paddling section, and all you really orchestrate are the transition areas. And it's your responsibility to decide what happens in between those 2 spaces, and then you all exchange maps.
Oh,
it's
wow.
really it's a low effort way to hone your race directing skills, do it informally. Mm-hmm. And while permitting is always a thought, I think from if it's a small event, if it's run if there's no income being generated, if it's basically citizens doing things on their own, you can do that with no problem at all. But I've heard that racers have kind of dabbled that. And we actually saw that during COVID, we had that. The guys at Trust the Compass, they had built basically in Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, they built like a 15-hour course just on their own. Just there was no fee. The maps were informal, but there were maps out there. There were checkpoints out there. There was places to go, and it was great. It was like these senior racers who had done this great thing in these sports just put these amazing events on. And I think that it sounds like that's what you did back all those 20 years ago. That you basically built your own course like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was not a very good racer. And so in some ways that helped because I think it's very easy to make a very tough course. Like what you're describing, I've done some of those with buddies, and they'll pick like these obscure little knolls and things that it's just so hard to get to. And are you really at the right one? And you take it for granted, but it actually is very easy to make something very, very difficult. And in those cases, dialing it back and knowing where to find a balance, that's, I feel like, a really important part of it.
That's the magic of being a race director, right? Making it hard enough that the teams that want challenge can get it, but not so hard that you pummel the teams that are having. There's that Goldilocks effect. Is it just right?
Right.
So that was 2004, and then you said that you went up toward New England. Sort of became a bigger part of your life. So when did the races start? When did Untamed New England begin? When did those races get going?
2009, I think, was the first one. Maybe 2008. It was in that time, just because I know that's when we had moved from the Virginia area. So we'd done some Untamed Virginia races after we had done some other races as out of the Tidewater part of southeastern Virginia. But yeah, Untamed New England, we decided we liked that because it was a name that is not too intimidating to like new people. It's not about like I don't know, epic defying death out there in the wilderness. It's just Untamed. You're out there exploring. And New England is generic enough. We could go and cover a variety of different states. That gave us the flexibility that we could really go wherever we wanted.
What was the time and the length of the first Untamed New England?
It was an odd duration. I feel like it was like 60 hours, maybe 66 hours. So it was not part of the Adventure Racing World Series. It was. I think I wasn't even sure if there'd be much demand for it. And, half of the teams I feel like I knew very well, like half of the teams that came out for it. I think we had maybe 25, 30 teams. So it's still, it had like a grassroots feel to it, but I think the areas that we went to ended up being it was really fun. And like in hindsight, I thought that was a great way to kind of start something off. And we would do one every year there for a number of years. And then eventually we had to slow down. My daughter was born and my focus kind of shifted into other directions.
Got it. And so what was the longest Untamed New England that you ran? How many days?
Yeah, 4 days, I guess, would be the longest. I think if we had let the course run out, we could probably have 7 or 8 days worth of course. But I feel like there's a sweet spot there as far as an American with limited time off and what you can really get away with, in terms of family time and just, picking up and leaving. So for me, even though I would, love to be able to do like a week long or something longer, I feel like you have a lot of canvas to work with in terms of a race. I always felt like trying to get it so that we could wrap things up within 4 days, 5 days at the max was always, I thought.
I always like the idea of you dedicate 2 weekends to it. The weekend of getting there, the week of racing, and the weekend of getting home. And so therefore you're asking for 5 days out of your work life to go and do that. And I think giving a week to it, right? Not really counting this to 4 weekend days. Of those Untamed New England races that you ran, I always find it interesting to talk about the learning curve of the race director, right? With the race you think you're planning, the race that you want to put on. And then when you actually put pen to paper, you build the course, you do all of that. And on the other end, you learn things about yourself and about race directing that you only learned because you put this big event on. What was your growth like as an RD over those years? What did you really feel that you changed?
Well, I think for me, the big lesson, and I think one of the keys to success, was relying on others and developing a plan that can be executed that doesn't require like adult supervision. So I've spent a ton of time here in the last several years of race planning, putting together like the timelines, contingencies, and getting it written down. So this is a script that our headquarters team, they can just run, and I cannot even be there and things are going to be okay, because I need to be able to, if we'd have an emergency, drop in and maybe take 12 hours. Like one time I had to negotiate these guys out of customs who were stopped at the border. So I need to be able to disappear for 24 hours. Like if it's not sleeping, it may be attending to an emergency or something, and the race has to go on. So really, for me, I thought the secret sauce there was always developing a game plan that was bulletproof, and that would be, all the phone numbers for all the various people you might need, and having that in a central headquarters that have ironclad communications. That's redundancy. We get like separate phones. We have to have a landline and a satellite phone. You make sure and test all like the internet. You need redundancies. There's all sorts of, it's almost like an emergency management plan that goes into this. And that way you can, herd the cohort of racers from the start down to the finish without needing just one person to have all the stuff in their head. Because I feel like that's too easy a trap to fall into, as certainly as a new organizer, is you just like, oh, we can wing it. And if it's a 12-hour race, you certainly can. But once you get beyond like a day and a half or two, you got to sleep, you got to recharge. You're not giving it your best if it's all dependent on you. So you really need to have a strong team with a really good game plan that you can rely on.
And as a result of being an RD, you invest a lot of your time into building it. You invest a lot of your reputation in who you are into building it. So you might take an outsized sense of ownership of what occurs. And as a result, then you kind of grab onto those things tightly, which then backfires because everybody has an upper limit. So you have to disperse leadership. You have to give things out to people. You have to have logistical people. And to your point, if you have to step off the grid, the organization can't come down around you, right? That's the big thing there.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for the last, 10 years of race planning, I think Todd Fallison, a buddy of mine who lived in North Carolina and then moved overseas, we would fly him in to help with headquarters, along with, we'd have a number of others strong, like Barb Campbell, it's another name you may know. We wouldn't hesitate to fund them and to cover their expenses and to make sure they're comfortable. Probably too nice. That's probably why I don't ever make any money. We take good care of people, but we try to do it because it's really key that they're there and critical to the success. And they may spend the entire time inside a windowless emergency bunker, which is not great, staring at dots moving on maps, and then like make sure and expediting U-Haul trucks. Like, it's not a glamorous way to spend a week. So we have to try and entice these folks somehow.
And I remember when I was done with the 2018 version of Untamed New England, which was my first multi-day expedition race, which was a learning curve that was incredible. But I remember when the race was over and we went to the banquet and we began to talk about the logistics behind it, the fact that you had like a full-on, like almost like an emergency operations management room, that people were in a room, they were projecting the dots on the wall, and they were managing. And I want to come back to the customs story. The second I've now said that in a second. But I remember 2018 that you had big weather blow in. You had to call people off the course. Tell us about what that experience was like.
Well, yeah, at headquarters, we had a rotating. So again, you have to have a schedule, right? 24 hours, 7 day. Well, it's not 7 days, it's like 5 days worth of schedule. And Michelle Falsher was also, I think she's been on. She and her partner were helping out there. I forget exactly who was staffing headquarters at the time, but we're tracking the weather, paying close attention. And I think it was thunder and lightning storms while they're paddling on the Piscataqua River, which, for those who don't know, the Piscataqua is considered kind of like this unpaddleable in terms of our race river, just because of the tidal range. It's enormous, and it's really notorious for rip tides. And anyone who we told, oh, we're going to paddle that river, they would like take a double take. And so we definitely had to invest a ton in the safety of that. So we had on the water safety crews at multiple points. There were some bridges that paddlers would go under, and the rip currents under those bridges could get really bad. And so when the storm comes in, this is now compounding what we had to do. And so, yeah, we had to hold racers at one of the transition areas before the paddle. For those who were out on the course, the chase boat had to go around and warn them. So you can imagine we have like this list of all the team numbers that are on the water, who have we communicated with, who have we touched base with. And I think by the time we were done, we had established, communications of some kind with every one of them. So they were able to get off. There may have been a few teams who just used good judgment to get off the water. I think actually now I'm remembering some controversy. Dave Lamb's team maybe got off the water with Latanzi, and there was another team that didn't, but they were supposed to. This is the stuff that will drive you nuts as a race director, like the minutia, right, of people haggling over whether they, deserve spot of 6th or 7th, but I mean, for pride and for other important reasons, sometimes it does come down to that. But yeah, so we had to go out for the safety of the racers and, I think put a halt on the paddling for a number of hours until the storm blew over.
And by that point, we were off the course. We were down the course a little bit. And if you back up 12 hours from there, overnight those storms came in, and that was when we wore the yellow brick trackers.
Yeah.
And I remember it was myself and my teammate Jimmy and these two other racers who we had found these two guys in the course of the race, and they were just having a hard time. And the four of us were together, and the yellow bricks went off, and we were told to seek shelter. And we came across, there was a church by the side of the road, and it was locked. It was locked, and we're not breaking into a church, and it was locked. We looked down to our right, and it was literally like a stable. There was like a place where we went into, and we took refuge, the four of us, bivy bags out of the rain, the whole 9 yards. And I remember being at one of my first experiences in an adventure race where things kind of got a little hairy, right? And it was time to you have to figure this out. Was it dangerous? I mean, we would have been fine, but the bottom line is we had to get off. We had to get off the road because of the lightning, and we ended up taking shelter in this, and it was a wild moment. And I remember after the race, we had taken a photo of the church. We sent the church a little check as a thank you for borrowing the good karma.
Wow.
Yeah, but that was part of the experience. And I remember being that was the first time in an AR that I was scared's not the right word to use, but I was like, wow, this feels serious all of a sudden. Like the weather coming in, the brick going off. It felt more than just a 5K. It felt more than a marathon or a triathlon. Mm-hmm. And I remember that. And then the next day was when you had to call people off the water. When that big,
that's right. Yeah. We actually had, I think, bad weather almost every day. Now that it's all coming back to me, from the very beginning, it was rainy and stormy. So you'd come off the Belknaps, and then we're going through kind of the central part of New Hampshire, I guess, at that point. Yep. Right. And then the devices have a nice feature where we can reach out and send a message like shelter in place, something to that effect.
And that's what we got. We got those. And I was remember with that race too. We had done that big Belknap. But if we go backwards in the race a little bit, I remember the opening trek was we started at Sunday River and we had to hike up. And I remember you telling us in the pre-race briefing that the safety bearing is south, but it'll take about a day or two to get to a road.
Yeah.
And thinking to myself, all right, off we go. Tell us the story. Now, this wasn't 2018. This was a different year of having to negotiate with customs, because this story is kind of legendary and it's been told a couple different times. So now you could set the tale.
So there were a number of years where I was a participating race in the Adventure Racing World Series. And so there's a collection of races, kind of marquee events around the world. One of them was in Ecuador. So I forget the order here. If I had gone down there and raced, I think I probably had, and I met the organizers. They came to New England and they had a team in the race. So this was a race we did up in the northernmost border region of New Hampshire, very close to Canada. It's a resort that's no longer actually operating anymore. It was called the Balsams. But at any given point, probably the furthest away in that race you got from the Canadian border was about maybe 20 miles as the crow flies. So one of our pieces of mandatory gear was a Xerox copy of your passport in a plastic bag. And it was not a joke. I think people thought we were joking, just for dramatic effect. But it was really critical because going through some of our pre-event permitting and conversations, we really identify, it's very easy to cross this border here. It's not like a fortified, sort of ditch or something you might envision. It's just, some different trees on the other side of the hill and you're off in Canada. So there was a transition area it was an old furniture factory for, I think, Ethan Allen, actually, near, it's in Vermont, technically. So these racers from Ecuador, I think they had their map upside down or their compass wasn't oriented right or whatever, came out of that transition area and just barreled north out of that old Ethan Allen plant. And within about 5 minutes, they crossed right into the border. They realized their mistake, but they had crossed north into Canada. And then so they turned around. And at the time, this was, I don't know, 2014, 2015. maybe even earlier, maybe 2012, something like that. But if you have a backpack full of climbing gear and food and other supplies, headlamps, it looks pretty suspicious to the Border Patrol from the U.S. They don't take that stuff lightly. And so these racers, they were held there. They scanned their passports. They called in. They had the race booklet, so they called into headquarters. And I got a text, I think it was Todd probably at headquarters, said, you need to get over to this station because they've got the Ecuadorian team and they're not going to let them leave because they don't believe the story that they're part of this race. So yeah, I dropped what I was doing, and it wasn't a quick drive. It was probably a couple hours from wherever I was to get over there to where the border crossing was. And then I remember meeting with the officers there and explaining, yeah, this is legitimate. I'm sure I probably looked the part with some Untamed New England stuff on. And
right. It would have been a big scam, right? For you to pull it off, it would have been like who's putting the time into this?
It would be a very elaborate, excuse here. And they could go to the website. They could actually see their team. And so they understood. But I think the border folks were happy to make an example that, you don't just casually do this. And so Unfortunately, they paid the price. It was probably about 6 to 8 hours, I think, that they lost there. And ultimately, they were routed onto a shorter course, which probably would have happened anyway, to be honest, with that course.
Right.
But once they were released, they were, relieved, and it actually formed a very close bond. And I think I did go back to Ecuador and have had a close relationship with other racers out of Ecuador before. Diego is a friend of mine. We used to stay with him when we went down there, and so he came back and did the 2018 race. And so we still, I think, have a special place in our hearts for the Ecuadorians. But they were sitting there. They looked, this was like day 2 or day 3. So they were pretty muddy and tired, kind of slumped in the chairs in the Border Patrol office, just waiting there for their American to vouch for them.
When you put the race course together and you build it, the races were always known for their ruggedness, their difficulty, their challenge. How did your own racing inform your race design?
Well, I think I started with that race that was 36 hours. So for me, a race hardly starts if it's less than a day. So I'm always thinking kind of a little bit bigger, trying to tell a story. I don't like to do lots of little circles and concentric, laps. I always had a challenge with USARA. This is now years back before their change in leadership. Couldn't do a nationals because they insist on having a central TA, which they would do, I think, to limit the complexity and the potential for mistakes and things like that, which I get. But for me, that's not interesting. I'd much rather have a linear course, explore some different areas, and be able to, give a sense of accomplishment to the participants that you wouldn't maybe get from just going round and around. I do think maybe one of the things that informs me the most from my race experience is just how different a race can be, and it can still be successful. I think too often maybe you have an idea that, well, your race is only good if it's like this other race that is also good. And I would encourage people to kind of think outside the box, or there's no box, right? Like, it's adventure racing. So I did a race in Patagonia, it's a horrendously organized activity, the Patagonia expedition race, but it's an amazing experience all at the same time. It's totally different than any race I had ever done before, but it was also fantastic in that way. And so I feel like that freedom, that liberation to just do something that maybe is unconventional, like pack rafting wasn't a thing, I think, until I started putting it into races. And actually at this point, I feel like pack rafting is a little overdone, and I almost regret it. If you see pack rafting on course too often, it's like, oh, some flatwater slog in a pack raft. I joke with a friend of mine, Mason Holland, that the pack rafting is great so you don't have to pay for boats, which is a hassle in the United States. But it shouldn't be in a race course because you don't want to find boats. It should be there because you've got some whitewater that pack rafting is fun on, or it provides some interesting navigation challenges. Or maybe not. Maybe my perspective is so, narrow. I wouldn't want to, pass judgment on any other event doing it their own way. I think their own way is kind of the greatest thing about adventure racing. Every race is different. Every person's perspective is different.
Well, and I think that's where the sport somewhat defies definition, and it defies being put into an easy box, because every single race director, whoever he or she may be, they put their own philosophical stamp on how they build their race courses. So you have this incredibly varied group of race directors and how they do things in different ways and how they use the course and how they do that. The pack rafting thing is interesting. This came up also with the Wilderness Traverse conversation, because we had talked about the idea of canoes versus pack rafts. And my experience, which is limited, I want to make clear about that. We had a great pack rafting experience at Expedition Ozark because we had a 30-mile whitewater pack raft, right? So that was great. That was great. That was a great use of it right there, right? We weren't just crossing a big body of water. But I think aside from that, what I've yet to see in a race, and I want to be proven wrong, and if race directors want to email me and tell me I'm wrong, feel free to do so. I really want to see a race design in a race course. I think this would be beneficial for the race itself if the presence of a pack raft and then the complexity of the water systems combined with the TAs, with the checkpoints, gave you a lot of different route choice. Right? That said, listen, we have a pack. We could trek this way, or we could raft this way, but we have this thing in front of us, which then creates a different mode of transportation. Let's go get them. And I think you see a little bit of a window of that in Eric Carvalho and Pack Rafting Adventures is doing the Eastern Mountains Wilderness Challenge. Adirondack Park, huge swath of land, 4 checkpoints. You have to carry your boat with you. And that's kind of a game on, right? That's a lot of choice. I think he's getting close to it. But I do agree with you that I don't think that the benefit of pack rafts have been fully realized, if you will, in adventure racing. But I think that might be location specific. I might be tough on race directors when I say that.
Yeah, that's where, I mean, I don't want to be like passing judgment because I don't know everyone's circumstances. And exactly right. I mean, there's I think a time and a place, and there's probably an exception for every case you can think of. But that model you describe is, I think, what I tried to provide in the cases where I've used pack rafts. And that, like, you've got a pond system through, a set of peaks, and maybe you go around, or maybe you paddle. Maybe you don't want to inflate the boats anymore. That kind of decision making. The more decisions, the better, I feel like, and the less it is just heads down, slog it out. There's no variety type of situation. I think the better.
I also remember too from my 2018 experience when I did that, and I'm sure you did it in 2013 too, but I was so overwhelmed by what was happening there that I had no clue what I was doing. I remember that in 2018, and I somewhere I still have the race booklet. Like, you really made it a point to tell a story. Like, there was a narrative around you, whether it be the Abenaki, whether it be the trek, whether it be the Belknaps. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say what I think, how you approach it, and please clarify it in their direction. I think that you look at race design, you look at race creation as the opportunity to write a narrative, to tell a story, and to have people take a journey. And you are now traveling lands that were traveled by an ancient people, and this meant more to other people. And it's more than just an athletic endeavor. There's more to it than that. Do I capture your essence correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, each race is a little different, and I try and find inspiration. Like, this was moving, like the route of water from the north to the south, from the peaks down to the Atlantic. And I mean, in New England, it is so easy to tap into that Native American sort of ethos. It's all around you. And so it just came kind of just naturally. I'm working with like the pre-race, like the video and all that other stuff. We really tried to double down on that, like almost a haunting type atmosphere. And honestly, that I feel like is a very important part of like a big race experience. And that it's like the window dressing, but it adds so much, I think, to the like, if it leaves racers with at least like a taste they can't quite, get out of their minds, months or years later, then you've done what you should there. And I think if you're not, it's kind of a missed opportunity, right, because every place has its own kind of angle and dimensions that you can highlight. And I would always try and do that. That's definitely the case. Yeah. And I think with the Abenaki, like the ancestral, like tribes that used to inhabit the area, I've been able to kind of reuse that time and again, maybe to a fault. So I have to find something else.
That's your narrative that you drive that home.
We can do. Or, I think, I've talked about it with some others too, but like there's these experiential entertainment groups that do like haunted, like cornfields, mm-hmm, and they also will like play into they're trying to set an atmosphere, and with everything they do. So with the merchandise, with the website, with their like the way they talk about everything, it's all consistent, and it's about delivering an experience. And I feel like that is certainly something that's a good race does.
It's more than just other sports where it's like we have a set course. You're going to run 26.2 miles here. You're going to run by. That's great, but like the physical effort is the goal of the event. Whereas there's this larger narrative, larger story that goes around behind all of this.
Yeah, right. And in 2018, I wanted people to arrive at that start and to not know where they were going to go, right? And so we load up on buses, and you don't know where you're going. Right. I mean, I just love this. I guess you're giving up the power there. And most of these people are very type A. They're very organized. They want to know details. They want to know, the dimensions of the boat so they can get a third seat in that canoe. I mean, they're going to ask you all sorts of questions. And so what better way to undermine that, pull the rug out than to just say, well, you're just not going to know any of this stuff. And so, yeah, it was a big hassle to stay at that resort the night before the race. But in my opinion, it was really important to set the stage and to kind of put people off balance you spend probably weeks prior to the race anticipating that, not knowing. And I think it's unusual. So trying to find things like that you can do in a race, it's like keeping it fresh. And that's also why you'll hear me like giving all these caveats. Like, I think there's no right or wrong answer for these things. And people, I'm sure, are more creative, going to find other ways, innovative, approaches to things all the time.
Do you think the growth of the sport, and this is we're getting more towards opinion here now, do you think that we run the risk of becoming too standardized? That there's a set of the way the sport is approached, and there's dare I say groupthink, that this is how races are put on, this is what races look like, and we've lost an edge of I don't want to use the term outlaw, I don't want to use the term rogue. I think that's the wrong way of describing it, but like that, this contrarian way of viewing race direction and race design, that we're getting too standardized.
I think there is a risk, though, in trying to turn it into something that maybe is a profit-based operation that you would then start to standardize, because that makes sense. Yeah, why you should reuse the course? Why would you only do it one time? Like, that's insane. You should use these relationships and then have the same race go through the same areas again and again. And then next thing you know, this would be easier if you start making these compromises. And this is where I'm starting to talk about, I think, the opposite of the way I view it. It's not about, getting something that's scalable and repeatable and efficient. That's actually contrary to what I consider a good race, to be honest. It doesn't mean, like I said, I'm a terrible businessman, though. Like, that's one of the ways I found to fail at adventure race businesses is to not worry about that. So I don't know. I mean, there's probably value in defining some sort of standardization, but I also think there's great value in knowing when to throw those standards just right out the window. And that's probably the art part of it. And I think anybody who's planning races, I don't know, maybe it's changed in the last 5 years or so. They're probably not getting rich from it, but they're probably finding it rewarding in its own way. And if doing it in a consistent way speaks to them or serves some purpose that keeps those races going, it's hard to say that's not a good thing.
Right.
You could say my races are great or fun to do, but they're hard to find. Certainly are right now. So, right. I don't know that really my perspective is the right one.
Well, and I guess to your point too, the attitude and the ethic that you want to bring into the race experience it's really hard to do. There's a limited amount of teams that actually access that, because there is an upper limit. I remember back in 2018 at the pre-race briefing, which I remember through my absolute terror of what I was taking on the next day, that you talked about the idea that you gave an overview of the race itself. And I think you said there's X amount of teams on the course, and there's a point in time in which you just can't have any more teams on the course. Like, if we want to give you this thing, we have to cap it at this number. And if we expand it greatly, we're taking away from the ability to host the course, to do all of that. And I think even back then, now going back all those years ago, 8 years now, that you really got of the really 6 years now, got the math wrong, that you really sort of understood that as a limit to what you can do, right? There's just only so many people you can put on a course of that size.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm too self-aware with that, because maybe there's a model that could make it work, and that I just not creative enough to see it. But for me, like what I enjoy is spending days and weeks, combing through these places, finding something kind of unusual or fun as far as terrain goes, and combining that together. And to do that in a way that can get, more than 200 people at the same time through there, it starts to get tough. And once you get to any number that's, going to approach something like a triathlon or like a marathon, 500 or 1,000, like, this is very different. This starts to look a lot like probably a mud run, know, where, okay, we can get people through here, and we need access, we need a logical safety protocol. Like, how do you have safety protocols with 1,000 racers on a 200-mile race course? I mean, it starts to become like you need a military with helicopters and things to somehow swoop in and help people out. So I think there's definitely a tipping point. It's a tough thing to do, is to say, well, we don't want any more racers on this course because we actually don't think we can support it safely. I think most races will probably cap out with where they feel they could saturate the market, and they'll take however many they can get. I don't know if there's a lot of races that like are turning people away left and right. But in a world where if you could have 1,000 racers, you'd have to be very careful with your race design there. And I think it would look a lot more like a triathlon probably than a navigation-based race.
Alan Wagner down in Broad Run Off-Road has run really, really successful, shorter single-day races, 6-12 hours. And one thing that he's done that's been really good, and I think other people do it too, is there's 4 or 5 disciplines that are on the course at the same time. And then like your route, you do them in a different order. Yep. Right. So the central hub, and you do the bike, you come back, you do the trek, you come back. And therefore you can spread those people out more. I think that adventure racing is a big umbrella term for what takes part in the course, right? And it's easier to define it by what it's not than by what it is, right? Because there's so much that goes on there. There's the Untamed New England ethic that looks at it. There's other race directors that do it. And there's that idea of the big tent exists. And then we have to be careful, though, because if we want to be something that we're not, we begin to sort of filter away what the sport is. But it's a big swath of land, right? There's a lot to work with right there.
Yeah, there definitely are. There, I think there's some creative ways of structuring your course, like you described there, that can probably make things more accessible. I think there's also the other extreme. I know, a race in New Zealand, this is a long time ago now, that only got permits for something like 40 people or something in a caving section, but the race had 300 participants. So You can imagine setting cutoffs in such a way so that only a small subset will actually get to the caving, which, holy cow, can you imagine prepping like all this climbing gear? And I don't know how you practice caving if you don't live where there's caves, but going all this effort in to try and participate. But actually the design all along is that only maybe 10, 20% of the racers will ever get there. Like, oh, that's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, I tell you, personally, if there was a 40-person limit to getting to a cave, I'd be number 41. I assure you that, my friend.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, guys, slow down. Really easy does it, guys. Slow down. That's not like that. I agree. So tell us a bit about your own racing experience. You mentioned PER. You mentioned Ecuador. Like, what have your own races been like? Who'd you race with? Where'd you go?
Well, so it's been a number of years since I've done anything more than like a small race. Like when I lived in Virginia, had a small group of friends that we would get together and do a lot of races. They've since kind of dispersed. Now they're actually, I think 2 of them live in the Netherlands now. The others I've lost touch with over the years. I'm terrible at keeping in touch with people. That's like almost my signature, kind of disappearing. So we would usually plan about 1.5 years in advance and kind of circle some date on the calendar. And like we did the Patagonia expedition race, and in hindsight was completely unprepared, like physically and mentally for it. But it was also fantastic.
Yeah.
It was great.
Now for the sake of the audience, tell us a bit about that race. If I understand correctly, massive big swath of land, 4, 5, 6 checkpoints. If you miss one, you're out. Am I relaying it properly?
Yeah. It's a little hard to describe because compared to like, I think the regular adventure race that one might do, doesn't really do it justice, but you fly down to like the southernmost tip of South America. And in our year, it was across Tierra del Fuego, which if you look at a map, it's like an island, like the size of, I don't know, Connecticut or something like that. It's big. And we took a ferry ride across to this island, and it was like, I think about 11 checkpoints as we went. And the number of teams was small. I think there was about 10 teams. So it was very small, and the staff was small. Everything about it was small scale, except for kind of the vision of the race organizer there. And he, I think, would set a course that he wouldn't necessarily pre-run or anything like that. Just kind of, pick a couple spots. Like we'd have a paddle section. We had a paddle section across the Beagle Channel. So if you know anything about the waterways down there, like you can paddle that maybe 1 day out of 20. Honestly, talking about a caving section for 40 racers, that was a paddle section for 4 racers. Right. And so, shocker, there was no paddling across the Beagle Channel. We ended up taking a ferry across. Right. But at least officially, the way it was drawn up was that was going to be a paddle, like a 15-mile paddle across that channel. So, I mean, it was just natural beauty and unlike anything I had ever seen, really, growing up in the United States. And at the time, we lived over in Europe. So to go to that corner of the world and get to spend like a week and a half with my friends there, that was a really great experience. The race itself, I think, I don't know, we bombed out somewhere in the middle. My feet, like I have a weird condition, I guess, where my feet like fall apart. Like there's like a friction burn thing I get after like 3 or 4 days. So there's a product I think it's called trench, that to go against trench foot in the UK. I should try that next, I guess. I've taped my feet, I've done everything I can. But anyhow, that race for me was like the eye opener where I was like, oh, this is like a debilitating thing out here. And ended up we got a helicopter ride from the Chilean military. It was about 2 days after we had dropped out though. So it opened my eyes that this was a race that honestly, they weren't. There's no accountability in the same way there is in the United States. There's not this culture like of, I don't know, litigation, right? That you're going to sue people if you don't get, what you feel is safe and proper. Like that, you're just going for it. And so there happened to be a helicopter on Tierra del Fuego, but it would only be ready in 2 days. So you had to sit tight. So we did. We sat tight on the side of a pond down there, and watched our rations deplete. But eventually we got our ride out, and it definitely left a huge impression on me as far as both what to do and what not to do. So trying to capture some of that, just the epic nature of these legs, which are straight lines between points the guy saw on the map and decided this would be great. Let me put them on there. But also trying to balance it with what is actually achievable, what can be supported, what can we, what's the lowest common denominator racer going to do on this course, and how do we make sure they don't, I don't know, come off injured or worse.
Can't imagine the feeling of being down in Patagonia. You look around at the start and there's 9 other teams, and you know where you are in general, and there's just this massive course in front of you. We raced a Terror in Scotland, and we raced in Faro, and those are huge swaths of land. But for as big as it felt, you never felt like it was so remote that they were at least kind of close to you.
Yeah, civilized.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like it was like you were out there, like the Highlands of Scotland are remote and barren and you're far away, but like it never felt like you were like on the other side of the moon. Right. That's the way it was.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely, at night, like you see the eyes of the alpaca looking at you like from the other side of the ridge, but there's like no light, there's no ambient anything, there's no towns, like there's just nothing there. And you just, in hindsight, it was probably foolish to go down there with as little expedition race experience as we actually had. But there's some poetry in that. The
confidence of ignorance, right? Like you don't know what you don't know. So you're like, oh, I'll be good. I'll be fine. I'll go get it. And off we go. And that's what happens.
Yep, exactly.
So what do you see as your now, you talk about the idea, you've been out of the sport for a while. You have other demands, you have family demands, things like that. As you watch the sport from a distance, and I don't know your level of involvement in terms of following the news and seeing the races and the direction of the course, what do you see as like your personal horizon going forward? Do you see a return to directing? Do you see a return to racing? Like, is this whetting your appetite? Because adventure racing, by all accounts, when you look at AR on a worldwide perspective, and you can credit Heidi Muller with the CEO of ARWS, you can credit the internet, the dot watching is helping in a big way. You could credit a lot of different things. It feels like adventure racing is on the rise. Like if you look at the Dark Zone, right, this little podcast of mine that I created in my basement, time over time, like we're growing in popularity in what is a relatively very, very niche sport. So has all of this sort of played with your idea to come back into the sport in any significant way?
Oh, wow. Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, because I really don't have like the perspective where I could know relative. Is it growing? Is it not? Is it, healthy versus not? For me, I just know, like I would look around at races, and I would know like half of the teams, like on a first name basis, back 10 years ago, and that's definitely not going to be the case anymore. And I always wonder if there's still like a demand for the type of race that I would organize. But in talking with Abby and Brett, and we talk, I don't know, maybe once a year, and I think at one point 2024 was like the year that would have worked out well for me to have an event in complementary schedule with, I think, what they have going on. And so I started to look into it a little bit, but I'm very selective and not compromising. And so if I can't get something done that I think is worthwhile, then I can't do it. I'm not going to just on an obligation put a race together, because there's no financial benefit to doing it. It's really a labor of love. But I think I still have that itch, and I think in the years ahead, I want to stay active and continue to like get outdoors, and I wouldn't rule anything out. I still have the itch, like in my head, I'm always, considering angles for, this would be a great leg for one reason or another, or a buddy of mine moved out to Alaska. He was Baxter State Park's chief ranger for a number of years. And so I remember just chatting with him, like casually, like, hey, I wonder, could we do a race like linearly from the north terminus of Baxter down to the south? What would that look like? And so we start to kind of put it together. And so I always had that itch. So I would never rule anything out. I don't have like specific plans. And it's mostly, I want to keep my options open.
I think you bring a lot of value to the conversation, right? Because you're somebody who's been in sport for over 20 years. 20 years in any sport is a long time, right? And you've seen the growth of the sport. And I will also argue, and this isn't just because you're sitting on the show, I could guarantee you that there's a generation of racers and race directors that the DNA of Untamed New England lives on inside their own races. I don't doubt that one bit. I think that the early ethic, the way that you built a race course, the way that you built a narrative, even the way that you approached, I remember distinctly back in 2018 when we had the pre-race briefing and you had shown the video and the video was amazing. And I'd never seen a flyover before and my heart rate was like 190 and holy cow. And I remember that you spoke a lot about two things that kind of stuck with us. And it was a combination of, it was a little bit, we were in school with you, but also it was, you were helping us out. You mentioned two things, right? You mentioned the idea of permanence, the idea that this is you're going to have a really, really, really hard time out there at some point in this experience, but you have to measure it against the idea that this is not a permanent event, that you will work your way, that there's another side to this thing, that we're on the other side of it. And then you also mentioned too, that we have surrendered, and I'm paraphrasing you a bit, except for the last part, we have surrendered our right to complain because we're voluntarily taking part in contrived inconveniences that we've elected to be there. And as a result of electing to be there, we lose the right to complain about the event. Obviously, if a race director does something dumb, silly, or stupid, you can carry on about it. But like, if a race is hard and you're finding it challenging, well, guess what, folks? You paid your money, you took your chances. And so and I remember distinctly you setting that tone for us as a group of racers, that this was more than just an athletic endeavor. And I think that's the way that you see these events.
Well, that's interesting to hear that you took that away. Because for me, like the permanence idea came to me, I don't know, like a week or so prior to the event, because I kept getting all these questions from racers who were not in the event, who were asking me when was the next one. And to me, it's just like an eye rolling, like, well, if they had signed up, 3 months ago, that we would have had room, but we had to close registration. There's lots of things, gates you have to get across between registering and when the start of the event. And so for me, it was frustrating because they took for granted that this race would be permanent, that this race, they'll get another chance next year. If it didn't work in your schedule, we'll try it again some other time. But it did pivot obviously to that, the ears of the participants that this is also, something that is transient and that, whatever you're going through, you shouldn't get too high and you shouldn't get too low because that's a way of life really to power through things. As far as the other aspect of it, I think I'm always very cautious about like the getting those racers who are going to try and, I don't know, it's like they pick apart like your staff and they're like trying to haggle over cutoff times or, there are certainly like some of the racers in just probably the public, there's a percentage that are going to be challenging for one reason or another. And if I could somehow redirect their frustration to me as the organizer and not to the people who are volunteering their time out there for like a week, to go stay in a tent, with the mosquitoes down by the Saco River for 4 days. Like that's a hardship assignment. And the last thing they need is for people to come to them and complaining about, I don't know, they thought this wasn't right, or this could have been better, or where's the, something about the booklet, the instructions don't have the proper punctuation or whatever it is. I always try and deflect that so that people aren't bringing that into the race and they save that all up for me. And sometimes that does happen and it's not, not something I enjoy, but I'd much rather have it than the people who are there of their own free will, just trying to, contribute to an event.
I was competing in a race one time and it was late in the race. It was like day 3, day 4. And you and I both know, like, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Right. And so races sometimes just things go kind of haywire, places get cut, things get added. Like that's the nature of the beast. And I remember being in a transition area and I was a competitor for this race and we were sitting there and we were doing really well. We were feeling good. We were in one piece, like that we were gelling as a team and we were sitting there eating, right. Cause we were going to eat, nap, and then we were going to start racing again. And we saw this team come in and this team was just blown. They had hurt. They were mad at each other from the course. They were getting bad news in the TA about the race was going and they were just pounding away at the volunteers. Yeah. And the volunteers, and this is a bit to the race director's mistake, was the volunteers really weren't prepared to answer the questions. There was course changes that they just didn't. I was sitting there and they explained it like 3 different ways to 3 different teams. And I was like, you may want to catch your breath here, guys. You may want to give someone a call and write down exactly what they want. But to your point, that if you're a racer, you're out there, the person you are to be frustrated with is not the person who's giving up their time to sit by a river or sit in a pavilion or like just be there for them and just sort of carry them through. And this is my lead into my next question here. I always like to say that in the context of an adventure race, whether it be as a director, a volunteer, or as a racer, you see the whole swath of human reactions and human emotions. And so in your experience, the teams that held it together the best, the teams that had the best experiences, what did they bring to the table from an attitude perspective? What did you learn by watching them? Because in some ways, we're kind of anthropologists, right? We have this community that we're keeping an eye on for 4 days, 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, and we see them evolve over time. What did you learn about human nature as a race director?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as humans, I don't want to get too philosophical, but we cope with things in different ways. And especially when you combine humans together, so into a team, like the dynamics involved, sometimes it's like a family and sometimes they're like 4 individuals. They each take care of their own thing and they come together only when they're about ready to leave. I feel like it's such a dynamic sort of endeavor. I feel like the teams that are highly competitive are kind of like serious and they're very mechanical when they're coming into these things. And it's like, you can almost hold a stop clock up and you can hear it ticking in the background as they go through their bins. There'll be like no wasted time. Actually, one of my friends from years ago, he was a great racer, but he hated talking to the media. He would never do a recorded anything, like any distraction, because he had to just be focused on getting from point A to point B and was all business. And while he was a successful racer, I would question whether he would win like awards for the happiest team on the race course. And I would always try to be the happiest team personally. That's probably why I wasn't a very good or competitor. We would always be there. What's the best experience? Well, it turns out stopping for 20 minutes at that ice cream stand in the little mountain village and trying this weird thing is actually amazing. Or taking the drink from the tribe in the Amazon. Yeah, maybe they spit the coca leaves into it. I don't know. We're going to do this because I'm never going to be here ever again. Out there for the experience and up for anything. I feel like there's so many different ways to answer that. And what would be successful for one team is probably totally different than another. Yeah. Probably sorting it out before you get to the race. Maybe
that's exactly
the main thing.
Yeah.
Make sure you don't have, podium aspirations and then 2 people show up who are 20 pounds overweight. Right. Speaking for personal experience, it's easy to have a bad time if you're not.
Or they're hiding an injury. They're not prepared. Their head's not in the right place. Like to your point, it's really important for the team going into the race to have a sense of what the dynamic is, what they want to be, who they want to be, and to talk about possible futures before you actually get to them. I think it's really, really difficult for teams to kind of navigate and negotiate like major team decisions late in a race when everyone's a little fried or a little beat up. And then what are we going to do here? Because that's when people kind of eat each other, right? That's when they kind of go at it. But on the other side too, and we had we had 2 professors off from Johns Hopkins not too long ago, and they did this whole study of adventure racing, and it's a really fun listen. One of the more popular episodes of the Dark Zone. It's clearly spreading to outside the sport. People are studying it from a team perspective. They said that the amount of time that teams have raced together, their experience with each other, wasn't necessarily a marker of a successful race. That there were some teams that met literally at the start line that had fantastic experiences, and teams that have known each other for years that had terrible experiences. But it was the alignment of expectations, what you were going to be and who you were going to be and how you were going to be on the course. And that's when things went really, really well. And so I think that's what you've probably seen along the way. When teams eat each other alive, they're in different places. I want to go faster. I want to go slower. Things like that.
Yeah. Also, I think when you're beat up and you're tired or cold or, not achieving the way you had hoped, it can sometimes bring out the worst in people. And it doesn't necessarily mean, they're bad people one way or the other. It's just they're under stress. And when people get under stress, their reactions are going to be all across the board.
Well, I think a really good team expectation is too, and I've lived this myself with my teammates, is that we all sort of agree that we're going to get mad at each other on the course, but being mad on the course and being mad off the course are 2 separate things. That there's going to be moments of frustration with each other, But when the race is over and you got a nap and you got some coffee and you got a sandwich in you, it's like, oh, that was a side effect of the race. That wasn't a side effect of personality.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think that there's these stories of teams that come together kind of at the last minute for a big race, and they're strangers when they start, and then by the time they finish, they're very successful and had a great time, or it goes the other way.
They never talk again.
It can go either way. I mean,
right.
There was a family at the 2018 race that they didn't finish the first leg of the race. I mean, the first leg of the race was not an easy leg, but I think they were out there for like 36 hours or something like that, and ended up getting led out by some of the ranger staff. And it was a father and a daughter and some other relative. I don't know. That was they didn't ask my opinion on whether I thought they could do the race, or if they had, I would have told them no. But I say that to everybody. That way I'm always covered. But they definitely had no business out there. So I feel like maybe I failed just positioning the race as something maybe they shouldn't have considered.
Yeah, at the end of the day, too, they're grown-ups making grown decisions. Well, a father and a family is a different story, but if 4 adults sign up for a race, and if you've well advertised what it's going to be, they knew what they were getting themselves into. And I actually saw that. I saw that in 2018. I remember being in the start line and seeing a team of 2, and even in my own amateur rookie, I'm new at this. Even I was kind of like, oh, they're in big trouble, and they were in big trouble. Like it wasn't gonna. I remember seeing the dynamic of them looking at maps for the race, and they were arguing over like the route choice to get out of the resort. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be a long, long race for that.
Yes, this is bringing back memories now.
When you look back upon your ethic, your philosophy, the way that you approach the sport, if you were talking to a room full of aspiring race directors, what would you tick off to them as like, I want you to be successful. I want you to really enjoy this experience. I want this to be worth your while. What advice would you give to them that you would say, listen, really focus on this. This is the thing. This has served me well. And I think that if you bring this attitude, it will serve you well too. What would you say?
Well, I think knowing what you want to accomplish with it, like, do you want to become the most wealthiest race director ever? In which case you probably are going to find some other pastime. But I think for those that are committed to the sport of adventure racing as we know it, I think it would be committing to a vision and sticking with it, even if it maybe for whatever reason feels different or unconventional or doesn't jive with, like races down in Florida are totally different than races like out in the west part of the United States or in, like you said, upstate New York. Like the terrain is going to be different. Probably the permitting regimes are going to be different. But the way you want to position the race and promote it, if you've got like a creative idea, don't feel like you're beholden to some, I don't know. There's not like an orthodoxy that you need to.
The idea of groupthink, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes we just as people kind of think, well, the people who know how to do this are obviously doing it the right way. So the right way to do it is their way. But I would actually say the right way to do it is still being discovered. And so why not just stop listening to what I have to say about it? Honestly, find something that, an angle that you're passionate about and then build on it and go for it. And if it doesn't work out for one reason or another, you can take some satisfaction that you at least pursued whatever your vision is and can adapt. Because I know if you're not going to become, financially, well off because of you're doing these races, you got to do it for something. And for me personally, the satisfaction of like the challenge, like the artistry of it is really rewarding. And it's almost the race part with the participants for me is kind of like an afterthought where, okay, well, we got to follow through with this. So we need a bunch of racers to come out and do the course. But if I don't love the hours and hours spent like by myself bushwhacking through like the wilds of Maine, I wouldn't have done it like that. And for each person, they're going to find what it is that speaks to them. And I would say, double down on that and your passion will show through.
Well, there you have it, folks. Episode number 100 of The Dark Zone. Thank you to Grant for coming on to the show and for being so comprehensive and thoughtful about his answers and his experience and how he sees racetracking, how he sees the sport. Grant was chosen, if you will, to be the 100th guest because his ethic and the way that he approaches the sport was so refreshing to me back when I started adventure racing that I wanted to commemorate his vision, the way that he sees adventure racing alongside the 100th episode of The Dark Zone. And a large part of who we are here, the way that we look at the sport, was born from his races and what he did and how he looked at along the way. Deep down in my heart, I have hopes for a return for Untamed New England. I think that Grant is a unique voice in the sport, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please like and follow and subscribe to The Dark Zone across your social media platforms. If they give you a chance, please rate the show along the way. The algorithm likes that. We love that you're here. We love what we bring to the adventure racing community. And remember, if you keep racing, we'll keep talking.